As we continue the MillSounds Atmos Barefoot Monitor Extravaganza adventure, next thing I want to look at is the Barefoot LFE-15 subwoofer. It's an over 100-pound beast. There's a lot of different options built into it. You can utilize it as an LFE in a surround sound system. You can even utilize it in stereo setups to extend things. So I'm going to walk you through some of the features and just talk about how I'm using it because, again, I've got a bit of a complicated setup here. You can dive into that more if you look at the video I did with the Audient Aurea interface I'm using to integrate all this together, but let's get down on the floor because there's no way I'm putting that 100-pound sub in my lap, so let's jump down to the floor. Before we jump down on the floor, there's just one more thing I wanted to show you that's a little unique to my setup. Because my front wall has the left and rights pretty tight and close together, there wasn't a lot of room to move the sub around to keep it centered. I've worked in a lot of rooms in the past that have nice subwoofers, and one thing I've always been able to pick out is when that sub is just sitting a little bit out of center between the two speakers. It really bugs me. So I knew if I had the sub, I wanted to make sure that it was centered exactly between the two speakers, so all the lows sounded more centered. Thankfully, it worked out acoustically in my room. I didn't have any weird nulls or anything, but because the LF-15 is really big and it had to sit between two tight pairs of speakers on the front wall, I had to find a shorter stand to put the center speaker on, and I just put that stand right on top of the LFE-15. I cleared this with Barefoot before I did it, but always remember with those dual firing woofers, when they're firing away from each other, they're pretty much canceling out most of the resonance that you'd get compared to just a single speaker inside a cabinet. When I mixed on the MM27s and when I had the footprint of ones in here originally that have the dual firing subs, people were always curious about it because a lot of people haven't seen that. And one thing that I'd always do is find a mix with a lot of low end, crank it up so it's really loud, and then have people put their hands on top of the speakers and you don't hear or feel any resonance when those things are really cooking. It's pretty impressive and blows a lot of people's minds, but I know a lot of you might run into the same situation that I did where space is tight, the LF-15's huge. Don't worry about putting a speaker stand on top of the LFE-15 and just keeping it short if you need to put a center channel. Not a problem. It's worked out great for me. All right. Let's crawl down on the floor. Okay. Wow, I'm never moving this again, I swear. I'm sweating a little bit. LFE-15, it's dual 15-inch subs in a huge cabinet. It's well over 100 pounds. I think when it came packaged in the box and everything, it was probably close to 150 pounds. So you'll probably want a little help from a friend getting this out safely. You can do it by yourself, but get a friend. Friends are great. We're going to start on the back and then move to the front. I think the first thing that you need to keep in mind is that the way Barefoot approaches subs is more like the rest of their line, where you have dual subs built into each speaker. So each speaker has a set of dual subs on it. Having worked on the MM27s for years and heard the rest of their line, I have to agree with Barefoot that in an ideal world, I think that's the superior approach. And there's a reason Barefoot has held out for so long to do a sub, because especially in stereo configurations, doing a sub with a more typical crossover like I'm doing, where this is being sent 80 hertz and under, and then my MM45s are dealing with everything over 80 hertz, a more traditional crossover where you're splitting the load between the sub and the speakers. That, I think, in Barefoot's opinion, isn't the most ideal or superior way to do it, and I have to agree. But having said that, I'm going to walk you through why I chose to do things the way I did and why I settled on the compromise that I did. But having said that, you'll see that the XLR inputs are labeled throughs. The really cool thing that Barefoot has done is they've designed a cool low-pass filter system in this to where if you plug this into a stereo set, it becomes an extension. There is no crossover in a traditional sense where the sub is only handling lows and then your other stereo speakers are handling the higher frequencies. Like in my situation, the sub would be handling 80 hertz and under, crossover at 80 hertz, and then the speakers are handling everything over 80 hertz. With the way Barefoot has set up their system to use these with a stereo pair, they become an extension to your speakers. So your speakers stay full range, and through the really clever filter system that they've done, it filters out those high frequencies gradually in a very specific way so that there's not phase cancellation like you can get from doing a crossover the way I'm doing it. So this becomes an extension to your speaker system. So in a sense, even if you have MM12s or something crazy, you could add these in and do the through system and extend those and just have an extension to your stereo system. I've tried that a few times as one of the first things I wanted to try with my MM45s because I was really curious. It sounds killer. It sounds so good and it's fun. So I can't speak to the accuracy of it in terms of getting clinical for mixing, but I will say just trying it for a day or two, wow, holy crap. It sounds really cool with my MM45s, doing it that way to where the speakers stay full range and then the sub through that low pass clever system that Barefoot's come out with just becomes an extension to your stereo speakers. Really clever way for Barefoot to do that so that if you're using this as the 0.1 in a surround or immersive system, you can still send to it as a single sub, or you can just use it as an extension system to your stereos, which I think in an ideal world, that's kind of how Barefoot recommends you do everything. Again, they've kind of held off doing a sub for so long because I don't think with their design philosophy, having a separate sub was not really, the Barefoot way. And I have to agree, after working on MM27s and a lot of their other speakers, I think the way I've chosen to do it is a bit of a compromise. But again, I'm going to get into why I've done that. So that's really the only things on the back. You do have a 1/4-inch output with a foot switch that comes with the LFE-15, so you can turn the sub on and off. And then you've just got a way to dial down the overall level of the sub if you need to do it that way. So let's flip this around to the front and we will go with the controls on the front. Okay, I lied. This is the last time I remember moving this. Well, besides having to put it back. But when I put it back, really, that's the last time I remember moving this. Did I mention it's heavy? Like a broken record at this point. It's really heavy. Front controls. Let's start in the scenario where you have a stereo set of speakers and you're going to use this as intended by Barefoot as just a low frequency extension speakers where you're keeping your main stereo pair full range and you're just going in through the through inputs and outputs to extend your system in a cool way. So you would make sure that LFE gain is at 0. You're going to take it from LFE to the boost mode because then that kicks in the filter system that Barefoot set up. And then you'll see a light switch here, but it corresponds to these two numbers here where you've got 80 hertz and 60 hertz. That's basically where the filter system kicks in. So I know with my MM45s, if you're going to do a more typical crossover, it's recommended that you start around 80 hertz on the MM45s. So 80 hertz in general is usually a good starting point. If you're going to use a sub, even in this way where the speakers are staying full range and this is becoming an extension. If you have a larger, bigger set of monitors that already go pretty low, like the MM27s or the MM12s, you might consider switching that down to where it's in the 60 hertz mode. So this is only handling 60 hertz and lower, so that this is only handling like your lows. But again, your main stereo pair is staying as a full range system. And it's sending that full range system through the inputs and outputs to your speaker system. Now, if you want to start using this with an immersive system where you need an LFE channel, a separate sub that you're sending to separately in like a 5 or 7.1, or moving up to Dolby Atmos, you want to switch it over to LFE mode. And then you have, an 80 hertz mode, because now that we've switched to LFE, it's corresponding to those two last numbers. You've got 80 hertz and 120 hertz. Now, there's going to be a lot of variables on having to decide how you're going to use this in your space. I know I'm also using this in my 7.1.4 Atmos system. And so in Atmos in general, when you have an LFE, you want it crossed over at around 120 hertz. It's got a much larger range. But depending on how your room is, what your speakers are, what you're doing, sometimes you might get a spec at 80. Just depends. But more typically, in Atmos, Immersive, and then just surround sound systems with an LFE, you're probably going to want to keep that at 120 hertz and make it a little more full range. When it's an LFE mode, you also have to choose the gain setting. Now, in a lot of surround sound systems, you might want to spec your sub to just be at 0, where it's just at a normal level. Now, this is a long story, not worth getting into in this video, but back in the dark ages of tape in like the 70s, when they first started thinking about using LFE subsystems in movie theaters to extend the low end for things like explosions or something, they were still running on tape. And the problem with analog tape is when you start pushing a lot of low end to it, you can overload the system pretty easily. There's not as much headroom when you send very, very low frequencies to tape. So the problem I think that they're running into initially when they were speccing subs originally back in the dark days of tape was that by the time they got the levels even for the rest of the speakers and then sent a similar level to the sub, it had to be pushed to the LFE so hard, that LFE channel on the tape, that it was starting to get some distortion. They needed more headroom. So their workaround for theater specs when they first started putting subs into theaters was to basically print to the low end track on tape 10 dB down so that it was quieter on the tape, but you had a lot more headroom. So they printed the tape 10 dB lower to maintain more headroom and fidelity. And then they took that and they sent that to the sub 10 decibels louder, or in this case, your sub is pushing 10 dB louder. Kind of an archaic, in my opinion at least, it's kind of archaic that we still keep that around because we're not really having to worry about stuff like that. But, for fun, if you want to in the comments, 10 points to Gryffindor to any of you that comment in the comments about the first movie that started setting up subs this way and why we have that 10 dB standard for immersive formats like Atmos. Because you have to remember, Dolby Atmos was not designed for music. It was originally just a theater system. And, all those specs and the ways that they've done it have rolled over into the music side of Atmos since we've started utilizing it now. So for me, when I'm utilizing the sub for the 7.1.4 system and the Atmos system, I'm having to make sure I'm in LFE mode and I'm popping up to the 10 dB mark because that is the spec for Atmos that most playback expects. And that's how Atmos is still set up for, again, some archaic reasons, but we don't need to get into that. So again, there are a lot of features on here to help you utilize this sub any way you need to use it. I will say one thing I'll be a little critical about, my one gripe. Right now, the way I've decided to do it, and you might want to, at some point, if you're really curious and you're running into this issue as well, where you want to share the sub between a stereo pair of speakers and your Atmos system, you can look at my Audient Audio video where I walk through how I set all this up. It's a little complicated, but because I wanted to share the sub between my MM45 stereo set of speakers and the Atmos system, I had to do another compromise where I basically decided to keep the sub in the Atmos settings where I had the 120 hertz setting in LFE with the plus 10 Dolby Atmos spec. Shot out my room that way for Atmos. It sounded great. Then I kept the sub in this configuration when I set it up with the crossover to where I set the crossover at 80 hertz, so anything 80 hertz and under is going to the sub. It's doing that cutoff with the crossover and sending all the information above to my MM45s. I kept the sub set up this way, and with SonarWorks, when I did the room shootout, it's insanely configurable. So it was actually able to determine that all those lower frequencies coming through the sub with this were way too loud, and it just compensated when I did the shootout. So I wasn't sure if that was going to work. Fortunately, it worked in my room with my system. But when you look at the graph for the SonarWorks shootout in my room in stereo, you get a huge bump in the low end because it's pushing way too much low end in the Atmos configuration for surround. But SonarWorks fixed that perfectly. So fortunately, I'm able to keep the sub like this for stereo work and Atmos work, where I'm doing the crossover at 80 hertz for stereo, and then switching over to the Atmos system, and, SonarWorks doing all that stuff under the hood. But because I'm doing it this way, I think my one gripe with the LFE-15 is that I really wish they would have come up with some sort of meme controller configuration to where you could have a little meme controller that plugged into the back of this and went to your desk, so that when I'm at my desk, I could actually toggle between these different settings with a rotary switch or something. It would have been really nice to be able to switch over for when I'm doing Atmos to have it going like this, and then when I'm doing stereo, have it switch over that way to where now it's not boosting 10 dB, and we're doing the crossover at 80 hertz internally and externally. Would have been nice to have all that in a rotary switch that is on my desk, because at this point, it's sitting under my desk right there. I'm going to be honest, I'm really lazy. It would be a huge pain in the butt to have to crawl under there and do that switch every time. It wouldn't be the end of the world, but I had to be realistic with myself and just admit I wasn't going to do that. But again, I'm missing out on being able to control a lot of that stuff on the desk with some sort of meme rotary switcher system that I could have put on the desk, so I didn't have to crawl under the desk and switch things, because again, I'm doing the 80 hertz crossover externally with my Audient Aurea interface. It sounds really insanely good when you get rid of the crossover system and just use this as Barefoot intended as an extension to where you're switching it over to the boost system. That sounds so damn good, but unfortunately, with the way that my system is set up, I'm just not going to be able to utilize that feature without having to crawl around to the back and switch some stuff and everything. So I think it's unfortunate that Barefoot came up with such a good sounding extension system with those filters, and that it's really difficult to be able to utilize them all without having to crawl into the back and replug things in, and then, crawl over to the sub and switch things on the front. Maybe at some point they'll do an update, and hopefully, I'm really hoping that they'll do some sort of system like the meme system where you have a controller to where you can control all this externally. But other than that, that's just some small first world problem kind of things. But you can decide how you do it. Again, I'm not necessarily doing this in the most ideal way that Barefoot would want you to do things, but the crossover system and the Aurea is really great. I'm getting good results, and the big decision with this was that if I was going to spend this much money on the sub, I really, really needed to be able to use it as an extension with the stereo system as well as the surround system. So I was able to figure out some workarounds for this, but I'm hoping in the future maybe Barefoot will consider some sort of external system for being able to switch this stuff without having to actually go to the front of the sub and crawl around back and do a bunch of other stuff. But other than that, really happy with this thing. It sounds really good. All right, buddy, you have to move. Watch out. Watch out. Oh, jeez. Okay, last time moving this, I promise. Oh, Lord. Oh, I need to get in better shape. I'm a mess. Ugh.